I made a rash decision a while back and it might have been a big mistake. When it's time for you to buy a new pair of speakers, how do you choose? I'm guessing you spend a while watching and reading reviews. Maybe you're lucky enough to have a shop where you can go and sit down and listen to a whole bunch of speakers before you make your decision. You probably read some specifications, look at the specs, the features, the design of the speakers online. Maybe you go so far as looking at frequency response graphs and crossover frequencies. Whatever you do, it's probably a better process than the one I took when I bought the $3,000 Harbeth P3ESR XD speakers over behind me that I've been using for about a year or so now. When I reviewed the Harbeths, they were the first passive speaker I'd used for many years. In the recent times up until I reviewed the Harbeths, I'd been using active speakers like the B&O BLab 3s and a pair of KRK Rocket 5G 4s. They're both active speakers. The BLab 3s are a hi-fi speaker. The Rocket 5G 4s are much more of a studio monitor. And so there were very different worlds I was coming from. The Harbeth looked great, they sounded good, they had a great reputation, and after I completed the review, which was a positive one, I asked the distributor if I could buy them instead of sending them back. And that might have been a mistake. Since I bought the Harbeths, I've also reviewed the Revel Performer M105s, and I didn't like those as much as the Harbeths, so that reaffirmed my original choice. But a sample size of one isn't exactly a rigorous comparison pool. So then along come the Monitor Audio Bronze 50s. A $600 ported two-way bookshelf speaker. These came to me as kind of a throw-in with my recent WEAM amp review, so I could have a set of budget speakers to go with a relatively budget amplifier. And by the way, a huge thanks to Radio Parts for sending me the WEAM amp and also the Bronze 50s, because these have opened my eyes. I opened the box of the Bronze 50s without too much anticipation. I removed the Harbeths, I put these in place, and I do have to say, I immediately liked the look of them. The grey front panel with that gold bronzy coloured tweeter just peeking through the waveguide. Yes, that's a waveguide, that's not just there for show. I thought these looked really good, and I should mention that if you don't like this colour, you can get them in a bunch of other colours too, of course. This is just what Radio Parts sent me, and I dig it. More importantly though, when I fired up the music, I found myself enjoying the Bronze 50s more than I was enjoying the Harbeths. What I'd expected was a drop in fidelity, probably a less balanced tonal response, and a sound that was cheaper. What I got was a sense of fun and engagement that I didn't know I was missing from the Harbeths. So, are they a better speaker than the much more expensive Harbeths? That's a slightly more complex discussion. The Bronze 50s use a 5.5-inch woofer that's made of a ceramic coated alloy. What that means for all of us is that it's a more rigid and light driver, so it can move more effectively. It's less prone to breaking up and causing distortion. Breakup being when the cone starts to actually warp as it moves. So this shouldn't do that. It should keep a very clean sound through the bass and the mids. Then there's that beautiful goldy bronze tweeter up the top that's made of the same sorts of materials as the driver in terms of it being a ceramic coated alloy. And that's a 1-inch tweeter that's crossed over all the way down at 2,500 Hertz. The tweeter's hiding behind this interesting looking waveguide, and what the waveguide's doing is it's making sure that the directionality of the tweeter is pretty consistent across the whole frequency range. So you're not getting different performance from the very high frequencies, which are super directional, compared to the lower frequencies, which tend to spread out more. The waveguide keeps them all on track. That should improve the tonal balance when you're slightly outside of the sweet spot, and also improve things like the imaging and the focus. At this level, it's probably unnecessary, but the speakers also feature a pair of binding posts on the back, and so these are bi-ampable or bi-wireable if you choose to do that. As I said, most people at this level probably aren't going to bother with separate amplifiers, but the idea here is that you can run a specific amplifier for your tweeter and a specific amplifier for your woofer if you want to. The Bronze 50s have a nominal impedance of 8 ohms and they bottom out at 4.4 ohms, so that makes them really easy to drive. They're not going to stress out any amplifier you're likely to connect up. They've got a sensitivity of 85 decibels at 2.83 volts, and that's measured at 1 meter away. And what that tells us is that they're not easy to drive, but they're also not super difficult. And indeed, Monitor Audio recommend having an amplifier between 20 and 80 watts for these, which seems about right from my experience. Of course, if you're in a smaller room and you're sitting nice and close, you can probably get away with a bit less power should you want to. And what that means is that if you want to pair these up with any of the current crop of fantastic Class D affordable amplifiers out there, they're going to drive these just fine. And of course, if you've got more money to spend, or you've got a larger integrated amp or receiver, that's going to handle these just fine too. One final design piece to mention is the rear port here is actually a rifled design. So rifled as in like a rifle barrel. It's got this grooved shape to it that, according to Monitor Audio, is going to help make sure that the air moves without turbulence and also moves faster because of less turbulence. Theoretically, that should tighten the bass, and it should also minimize the port sounds, often referred to as a chuffing sound when you can hear the air pulsing and pushing through the port. It's one of the reasons that I really don't like ported speakers in many cases, because they do tend to get that chuffy noise quite often, and we'll come back around to that soon. Now, if you don't want to worry about what all those technical bits and pieces mean, that's totally fine. Let's plug them into an amplifier and talk about how they sound. And straight away, I think these are just bunches of fun. They're not Klipsch-like fun, they're not fireworks and explosions fun, but they're an enjoyable, somewhat neutral/natural speaker. You could almost describe them as a fun-sounding studio monitor sound, if that's not an oxymoron. The treble is a little bit elevated in the upper end, and that makes them energetic. It gives them a little bit of sparkle, a sense of clarity, but it's not done to the point that they ever get harsh or glary. At least not here in my office, which is a relatively modest sized room, or in my larger living room space. The mid-range from these is more on the neutral side. It's not quite as rich as what you get from something like the Harbeths. It's a little bit drier, a little bit more neutral, but they're not sterile. And I'll be able to explain that a little bit more when I talk about how they directly compare to the Harbeths. The bass though, that's where these get really impressive. My office here has a pretty significant resonance in the mid-bass area, and it does affect these as well. But that's not their fault, it's the room. What's impressive though is that the bass delivered by the Bronze 50s is tight, it's punchy, and it has a sense of a greater foundation and depth than what the measurements would suggest. Despite being a small speaker, and despite measuring as actually having significant roll-off as you'd expect from a small speaker, these come across as having really solid and quite deep bass. The bass doesn't sound like it falls off a cliff with these in the same way that it can from other compact speakers. These feel solid and deep and authoritative in the bass, in a way that I rarely hear from a speaker of this size. It is worth noting that Monitor Audio suggests that you can place these much more easily without worrying too much about the room thanks to this rear port. In my experience though, it's not quite that simple. In this room here, where I had one speaker that faces back towards the windows and the other one into a corner, and in both cases they're about a meter, maybe a little bit more than a meter away from the wall, in this situation there was a clear and obvious increase in the bass from the speaker over on that side near the corner. So the fancy porting is not suddenly going to make them immune to where you put them in the room, but the good news is that the fancy porting does completely remove any chuffing sound. I didn't once hear them making any noise from the port, and probably more importantly for me, they've somehow tuned them in a way that you don't hear that point of emphasis from the port. In some ported speakers, they're really good at producing bass within a very narrow frequency band, and you hear that in the music. Across a wide range of genres and at all different volume levels, I never once heard sounds from the bass from these that wasn't completely natural. Yes, they were influenced by the room, but the speakers themselves were doing a perfect job from bottom through to top. Now, if you do find that these do get too bassy, if you need to put them close to a wall, and even worse, close to a corner, Monitor Audio also provide you with these. These are little foam port plugs. You can jam those into the port at the back and they'll tighten the bass up a heap. You will lose that sense of depth and foundation in the bass. It makes them sound much more like most other small, sealed compact speakers, but it can be a great thing if you're having room placement issues or if you're going to be running a sub anyway. So without having done any direct comparisons at this point, I was enjoying the Bronze 50s a heap. They were clearly more enjoyable to me than the M105s from Revel, and they were a lot cheaper than those too. About half the price if I remember correctly. So let's come back around now to the question of whether these are actually better than the Harbeths, because I was definitely enjoying them more based on casual listening. And that might be all you need to know. If you're just looking for an affordable and enjoyable speaker, you can probably stop the video right now. But if you want to know just how good they are, let's dig a little bit deeper. I tested both of these speakers with no EQ, doing nothing other than putting them in exactly the same place in my room, which is very modestly treated. I've got some foam pads around the walls to stop too many reflections, but it's not a properly treated room. But the point here is that both speakers were performing in exactly the same position, exactly the same distance from me as the listener, and exactly the same room environment. The first thing you notice as you compare the two is that the Harbeths are a little bit more rich or lush in the mid-range. Not drastically so, but there's just a little tiny bit more warmth and soul from the mids in the Harbeths. That's actually what I really liked about the Harbeths in the first place. Being a sealed enclosure design though, the bass from the Harbeths absolutely falls off a cliff. And that's what makes the Bronze 50s a bit more enjoyable straight away. I think that, combined with that slightly lifted upper treble, really brings a sense of energy and engagement to the Bronze 50s that just makes them instantly enjoyable and engaging without being significantly coloured. These aren't really a V-shaped speaker, they've just got a little dash of fun added to them. Other than that though, between the Harbeths and the Bronze 50s, everything was mostly similar. Mostly. On Help Me Lose My Mind, the hi-hats were crisp and snappy from both speakers. There's probably a little bit more energy in them from the Bronze 50s, but both speakers presented the hi-hats and the energy there really well. The bass, on the other hand, was the clear winner for the Bronze 50s because it was tight and punchy, but never loose or out of control. On Louisiana 1927, the sound was even closer between these two because there's no big thumping bass to separate them. However, on this track, I did notice that the Harbeths were bringing out just a little bit more nuance in the strings. There were finer details and a sense of character to the sound that I didn't get from the Bronze 50s the way I got from the Harbeths. I also found that I could get a little bit more texture from the vocals and the strings from the Harbeths too. And so the Harbeths were giving me just a few % more insight into the music, but it was only a few %. Where the biggest difference lies though is in the soundstage. And this has been something that's been true for me across years and years of doing this, is that as you get to higher level gear, what you're often getting is not vast differences in tonality or frequency balance or tonal balance. It's often more about the subtleties of things like sound staging. The sense of width and lateral separation of sounds between the Bronze 50s and the Harbeths is as good as identical. Without having them set up in an ideal location where I could switch rapidly between the two speakers, I don't think you're going to pick a difference. What I could pick easily though was the sense of layering and depth. That's where the Harbeths start to pull away from the Bronze 50s. The Harbeths present more depth in the soundstage, and that makes the positioning and imaging of sounds along the Z axis, which is your front to back, that makes those much easier to pick out. What it also does though is produce a greater sense of three-dimensionality in each individual sound. So a singer is no longer a flat plane of sound, the singer now has some shape in 3 dimensions. Now that's of course assuming that your source chain is able to deliver that quality of signal to the speakers. I was using a really high-end source chain here, and that's another key in talking about the Bronze 50s. Because what all this means is that the Harbeths are still the more technically capable speaker, but they really need the right genres and or a subwoofer to really shine from a musical enjoyment point of view. If you're looking for a studio monitor for things like I do, which is often just editing voice, they're completely fine, they're great for that. They're probably also overkill. The Bronze 50s, on the other hand, are much, much cheaper. They're going to work on any genre at all without a sub, and they're also just more fun. And so, did I make the wrong decision? And am I swapping the Harbeths out and bringing the Bronze 50s in? Not exactly, but this review has done 2 things for me. Firstly, it's absolutely convinced me that I need to get a sub. If you've got any recommendations for a great, compact and affordable subwoofer, let me know in the comments down below. I haven't explored that space for many, many years. And the other thing that the Bronze 50s have convinced me of is that not all ported speakers are evil. They just have to be executed well. And these definitely are. So if you're in the market for a fantastic compact speaker that's very affordable, you should definitely check out the Bronze 50s. If you're here in Australia, a great way to say thank you to Radio Parts for sending these over for me to review is to use the link down below through to them. I'll also put some other links for those that are not in Australia down in the description below. For now though, thank you to all channel members here on YouTube, thank you to Patreon members, and thank you to all of you who send super thanks for your favourite videos here on YouTube as well. If you've enjoyed this video, I've got another one up here that's all about the Harbeths we've just been discussing. But for now, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.